Welcome to the screencast for The Defense of Socrates Part 2. So last time in Part 1, we talked about the first section wherein Socrates was accused of 3 crimes: sophistry, atheism, and corrupting the youth. He spent the first part of the dialogue defending himself of these crimes. So when we read philosophical argumentation, we don't want to just accept what the person is arguing for. Remember, they're trying to provide evidence to prove a conclusion, so you should believe it. When he confronted the idea, Socrates, in Plato's dialogue, of the fact that he was a sophist. So this is the conclusion of his accusers. Socrates is a sophist. Socrates took the opposite position, of course. I am not a sophist, and then tried to provide premises or evidence to show that he is not. He claimed first that he doesn't accept payment, so that is one piece of evidence that he is not a sophist. He defined sophistry, which we still use this word today. We mean it a tiny bit differently, but it's very closely related. And he defined it as the art of rhetoric alone. So he said what he did and what philosophers do is to try and get to truth or wisdom instead. And that difference right there disproves his accuser's claim that he was a sophist. The second crime, atheism. His conclusion, I am not an atheist, I'm not impious. Excuse me. And his first piece of evidence was the fact that his life's work came from the oracle at Delphi, that he was given a mission from the gods to strive as much as he could for wisdom and truth. So then he finally made the analogy that since he's acknowledged spiritual concepts, he must believe in the spirits himself. So a lot of people find this argument maybe one of the least compelling that are in the Apology. It's a metaphor that's probably valid to the situation, but it leaves out a lot of other possible argumentation. Because, of course, anybody can acknowledge that a certain concept exists. That doesn't necessarily mean they believe in it. The third one, that he was corrupting the youth. His argument was he likened being a philosopher to being an expert in discovering truth or wisdom, and said that looking for truth is not corrupt. He hasn't really defended that yet, but we'll see that he does so a little bit more later on in the dialogue. Another possibly weak bit of his argument was when he said nobody deliberately corrupts anyone else, because then the person they corrupted could come back and harm them. It might be a weak argument, it might be the start of a good argument. It's one of the ways to show that evidence isn't always convincing one way or the other. It's hard to decide what counts as solid enough evidence to believe someone's conclusion. It's not clear in every case. And at the end of the last screencast, I asked you to think a little bit more about why admitting your own ignorance might be considered a virtue, why it is important to Socrates. So in the first few articles we looked at from Bertrand Russell and the Beardsleys, they made similar claims that a reasonable person is one who looks for the truth, or if the truth is too obscure and the evidence too confusing, at least they look for the most well-supported belief that they can arrive upon about any given issue. I wonder if you think that this is an important value, and why or why not. So sophists, as we might recall, they teach rhetoric. It's aimed at being convincing no matter what. And that can take on all sorts of tactics: emotional manipulation, metaphors that don't really fit the situation but sound very good. Abuse of maybe a straw man. So all a straw man is when you make a parody of your opponent's argument, then you destroy that parody and pretend you destroyed your opponent's argument. So that's a logical fallacy. Another one is a red herring. If you draw the listeners down a side path and convince them that proves the original conclusion is right or wrong. So all of these things are obviously not aimed at the truth. They're aimed at winning argumentation. But let's think about the other side. Mastery of language isn't always dishonest. Now, because you can explain something well, is that inherently against seeking truth? Now, Socrates and philosophers, we haven't gotten really an argument, like I had mentioned, that the wisdom or truth that he's referring to, we haven't gotten a definition of it or what it looks like when we try to get it. It seems very intangible and abstract. With philosophy, you want to be careful, especially when we use words that we use in everyday language, because we're all going to have an idea or a sense of what we think wisdom and truth are. But if we want to get to the best supported beliefs that we can't leave it at that intuitive level. We need to investigate what we mean and decide whether or not that definition is the best supported definition for the evidence in front of us. So now we move on to the readings for today. So from pages 26 at the very bottom, in the very last paragraph, to the top paragraphs of page 33, Socrates gives his closing statements. And in it, he starts to explain why he believes philosophy is important, why he thinks searching for wisdom and truth matters. And we'll come upon this mind-body split over and over and over again in Western philosophy. We saw it when Russell mentioned the goods of the mind versus the goods of the body. And we see it again here. Socrates talks about how it's natural to want to accumulate wealth and societal influence. Those are material goods, and they make your physical life easier. But he wonders why most people neglect the spiritual goods. So for our purposes, we can equate the soul that Socrates mentions to the mind. He also means the appetites that we have, the animating life force that's inside of us. But it's the abstraction, the mind, the heart of who we are as people. And the only way to be a good person or a just person is to care for your souls as well as your material needs. And sort of like Russell, but definitely here, the mind is elevated above the body. And I want you to take a minute to think about how that isn't necessarily proven to be the case, that mental and spiritual issues are somehow better than the physical world around us. But also think about all the major religions and how that is a very indoctrinated assumption in most of the Western world. So, if to be a good person you have to work on perfecting your soul just as much as you have to perfect your bodily life, it's morally the right thing to do to seek truth, to seek wisdom. Remember that when philosophers use the word morality, they mean the way we think the world ought to be. So if we think people ought to be as good as they can, for Socrates, they need to improve their souls as well. Socrates doesn't really go into a whole lot of detail about his conceptions of justice here. So I'll tell you a little bit about one of Plato's most intricate and largest works. It's a book-length dialogue called The Republic. There are some excerpts of it in our textbook if you want to take a look. I don't think I have it on the semester, or the syllabus for us this semester. Also, you can find all of Plato's dialogues online. They're well out of copyright. So in The Republic, he builds up his ideal vision for what the ideal person would look like if they perfected their bodies and their souls, and what the ideal city-state or nation would look like if the citizenry perfected it. And he thinks it's all tied together. On the right here, you see I have the tripartite soul. On the right, he thinks the circle represents a human soul, and on the left, the circle represents a perfected city-state or nation. And he thinks justice is a kind of balance in which you organize yourself, you're always self-ruling, and you act virtuously in every situation. And in order to get to that point where you have a balanced soul, you need wisdom, courage, self-control, and then you become a just person. So since philosophy aims at truth, and you have to look for truth in order to be just, you have to try and strive to harmonize your soul. And Socrates sees it as if he were sent by the gods, that message from the oracle, to show people that they need to figure out this balance through his dialogues, through his inquiries. So this group of fellow citizens threaten him with execution, and his friends ask him why he can't just renege and say, okay, I'll shut up to avoid death. And he says, we don't know anything about death. We don't know what happens after death, so it's an unknown. And remember, Socrates does not claim to know what he doesn't know. He'll admit that he doesn't have that wisdom. But he does know that giving up his God-given mission would be impious, and that giving up what he sees as the seeking of justice is also a moral bad. So instead of avoiding death, which is an unknown, he should continue pushing people to seek wisdom, even in the face of death. So he doesn't want to be a coward. He compares it to a soldier deserting. And in real life, when he was younger, he was a soldier. And he thinks impiety is an obvious bad thing. These are known bads, while death is still a big question mark. So he would prefer death to the things he already knows are bad. Next, in his closing words, he points to all of his supporters in the audience. Some of them are the youth he's supposedly corrupted, and they've grown up and they're middle-aged men. Some of them are the fathers of this youth, and they're all still there to support him, but he supposedly corrupted them, right? So why would somebody corrupted support him? And the only thing Socrates can come up with is that it's the just and honorable thing to do. And finally, Socrates spends some time telling us that he will not beg and cry and plead and bring up his children and his wife to be spared, because that's another form of dishonesty. He's so focused on the truth and so focused on presenting the kind of life you should live if you want to be a just person, that he won't do these emotionally manipulative things. Even though this was the custom of the time, the jury expected it, and later on they reacted to his not doing so very poorly. So the jury goes away and comes back and delivers a guilty verdict. Now it's time to debate as to what the punishment should be. His accusers, I think there are three, Miletus and we saw in the last screencast, but I can't come up with the other two off the top of my head. I'm sorry about that. They argue for the death penalty, and Socrates is given the chance to respond with alternatives. So here I have a little quote from page 33. I tried to persuade each of you to not care for any of his possessions rather than care for himself, striving for the utmost excellence and understanding, and not to care for our city's possessions rather than for the city itself, and to care about other things in the same way. So he sees this as a service that he's provided for everybody. He never forced anybody, he never took money, and he never said that they had to listen to anything that he said. And he has no responsibility for the people that they came to be after they listened to him talk. So since he thinks he provided a service for Athens for his entire life, he thinks that he should be so-called punished with regular free meals at the, I don't actually know how to pronounce this, but this was a sacred kind of community center, a gathering place, thought of as the heart of the city. It's where they entertained the elite and where they celebrated Olympians coming back from victories. So Socrates thinks he should be punished with free meals there for the rest of his life. Then he goes through other possible punishments and he rejects them. It could be a fine that he has to pay, but he has no money. He's poor because he's never accepted payment. His benefactors jump in, including Plato, who would have been about 25 at the time, and they pool their money together and come up with a pretty big sum. This is rejected, even though he offers it to be the fine that he pays. Just like death, imprisonment is a known evil. It's a known bad, and death is still unknown. It's coming for him anyway. He says later he's past 70. Banishment might be the worst. He would practice philosophy in any city-state, and the response from the populace would be exactly the same. So he'd spend the rest of his life wandering, being bounced from city to city, when his heart is back home in Athens. Also, a known evil. So his penalty is decided then as execution. He tells the jury that death comes for everyone. So we can't think of it as the ultimate evil. But those that voted against him committed injustice, which is far worse. It damages their souls, makes them less human even, less balanced, definitely. Those who voted for his innocence, he invites to speak with him later. There's another dialogue called the Credo that takes place in his jail cell right before the execution is carried out. His old friend Credo comes by and says that he has planned an escape route for him. He's bribed the right guards. They're ready to go off, and he can live at his friend's estate for the rest of his days. Eventually, Socrates explains further about his conceptions of justice. He takes his hemlock and then dies. Back in this dialogue, he says death might be a good thing. It's either complete non-existence or communion with the gods. So, who wouldn't? Who thinks he's lived a very good and just life? Want to commune with the gods, want to commune with perfection in the afterlife. On page 37 he says, nothing can harm a good man, either in life or in death, nor are his fortunes neglected by the gods. Because, okay, anybody can physically harm you. They can restrict your movements by imprisoning you. They can beat you up. They can send you for execution. but that doesn't harm your spirit or your soul if you are a just person. Those are the ultimate goods of life. And since gods are the ultimate goods in the entire universe, if you spend your life living toward those ideals, they're not going to not notice when you pass into the afterlife. So to sum up, we talked a bit about how Socrates wants to convince his fellow Athenians that moral or spiritual goodness is more important than material goods, and that the gods believe this as well. So why should seeking of truth be the highest good for mankind? Why shouldn't it be amassing wealth or living a comfortable physical existence? Socrates' answer, not detailed as well as it could be here, but in other places. And we'll see this also reflected down the generations all the way up to today. Excuse me. Truth is perfection. And the gods are, of course, perfect beings. Mankind is fallible. We make mistakes all the time. We're in error all the time. We do morally corrupt things all the time. And since the gods are not, we should be striving to be more like them. We should be striving to understand the universe in the way that they do. And the only means that we have available to us to do so is to seek truth. So if we want to be better than we are, we need to seek truth. And that is the speciality of the philosopher.